to the stream. Today we're looking at actualize.org's video on simplicity and why not everything can be explained simply. That should be fun. It's a topic I'd like to talk about, and hopefully we can get parsed into the ideas of precision and how precision doesn't really translate through different domains. So something that's simple in one way of thinking won't be simple in another way of thinking. Maybe we can get farther into different ideas of simplicity and precision and how to explain things and what can be explained and so on and so forth. I like this idea, and I would like to refine, deepen my understanding in this area. So that's our plan for the day. Should be relatively short. It's a much shorter video than normal from Leo, so that's pretty cool. And we'll be getting right into it. So I'm excited to see it.
A quick note before we get into the main topic.
Whoa! Not enough pixels. Hold on. Let's fix that. Here we go. Hey. What's up, Leo?
I've recently launched the Actualized Clips channel, which is a second brand new Actualized channel which contains short snippets of my long content. So if you're having difficulty keeping up with all the overwhelming long-form episodes that I do, go check out the Clips channel. I've been getting a lot of positive feedback from people on it. People seem to love it. So maybe that's for you. Go check that out. It's free.
Okay.
All right. And you'll find a link down below to that. All right. So let's get into the main topic. So the topic here today is this misconceived notion that I see a lot of people subscribing to, and it's very self-deceptive. It's the notion that if you can't explain a thing concisely and simply, then you don't understand that thing. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of this notion before?
I've heard this notion many times.
A lot of times people will use this as an excuse to dismiss certain ideas that they hear.
Yes, and they also oftentimes don't accept the simple way of explaining it, because it may be simple in one way of thinking, in one way of framing the issue or framing the problem or way of thinking about the situation at hand, and it's very simple in that sense, but they want it to be translated to a way that they can understand it and be simple in that way, but it's not possible sometimes not possible.
Because especially like my content, I'm very sensitive to this because my content tends to be very long and people have such short attention spans that they say, well, Leo, surely there's no need to sit around and talk about the nature of science for 5 hours or for 2 hours. Surely if you have such a deep understanding of science, you can explain it to me in 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. Or for example, like, well, Leo, you've got videos about God, explaining what God is, like a 3-hour-long video on the nature of God, and that's just part 1, and then there's a part 2 as well. Surely God can't be that complicated. If you really knew what God was, then you should be able to do a 5-minute video on God and explain it to me. So Leo, that proves you don't really know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. This is a very common line of defense that the ego mind takes. And I'm not just saying this from sort of a personal perspective, like I'm coming from some butthurt place about this. No, it's a common defense tactic that I've seen used elsewhere, not just with my work.
He also seems a little butthurt, so we don't want to like ignore that also.
Of course, my work is particularly prone to this kind of attack. It's a false attack, and we're going to deconstruct it here. But it's particularly prone to that because my bias is for going very deep on these topics. That's my whole thing in life. It's like I want to have the deepest understanding of reality humanly possible.
Wow.
That's my whole thing. That's what I devoted my whole life to. And so you should start to perhaps suspect that maybe if what you're after is depth of understanding, that's going to be a little bit more difficult than what you can achieve through a 5 or 10 minute video or a 5 or 10 minute explanation. I want to explain to you why that is.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it's actually interesting because this kind of defense is oftentimes used by rational people, scientifically minded people, atheistically minded people, and so on, especially when it comes to more philosophical topics and questions and more spiritual or mystical topics and questions and issues.
Right. So it's very common amongst those types of people that he's referring to, because the idea is that it's kind of a hidden assumption, and I'm kind of making it a little bit more extreme so that we can understand what I'm referring to here. But the idea for a lot of people here is that there is one way to explain things, and there's only one valid language to use. So everything must be translated to that single valid language of this sort of normal, intellectual, rational, logical type of language. And if it can't be explained simply via that language, then it must not be valid. But that completely ignores all the other types of languages that may be useful and could possibly explain the thing very simply in those other types of languages. For example, I'm not sure if I'm ready to get all deep into the examples here, but we can imagine a person who is trying to understand music and they reject using music theory to understand the music. Or they're going to have a very hard time using physics to understand music, because physics is not the language used to describe music. We've done a very good job of distilling music theory to cleanly and very simply describe music, and it works really well. But if you reject using different languages, if you reject using music theory, and you try to always go back to using physics, well, things are going to be very strange and not work extremely well. So we have to have this kind of understanding that different languages can describe different things simply in their different fields. Hey, Kurt, what's up? If you're not listening, just want to say hi. Well, I appreciate you for checking out the other video. Thanks so much for stopping by. Much appreciated. I love your content, man. I'll keep doing what I'm doing. Thanks for stopping by.
Is that they tend to think that like, oh, well, if this guy really knew what he was talking about, this mystical stuff, if this mystical stuff was really true, then it should be very simple to explain. Mm-hmm. Well, but why would you assume that? Mm-hmm. Because after all, let's really be even-handed about this. Let's really make sure we're being neutral, that we don't have double standards that we set for science versus the mystical stuff, or for philosophy, or for any kind of inquiry into the nature of reality. Look at it like this. You spent 12 years learning mathematics in school. 12 fucking years.
A long time.
Of misery and pain and torture, racking your mind trying to understand even something as simple as subtraction, multiplication, and division. Try to think back into your past. First grade, second grade, where you were struggling just to understand how subtraction works.
It's very difficult for me to try to think about first grade or second grade struggling to understand mathematics, right? Some basic arithmetic. It's very difficult for me to think about. But I understand the concept, right? It took a long time it takes a long time for kids. It took probably a long time for myself to understand something very, very basic, such as subtraction or any other mathematics or arithmetic. And even other things that are very simple, like comedy. It takes a long time for kids to understand comedy. It takes a long time for kids to understand narrative. And when we try to get into these new fields, suddenly we want everything to be extremely simple and understandable in whatever language we've already developed. No, we have to develop this new way of thinking, really. We have a whole new cognitive process. It's not wholly new, of course, but it's a whole new cognitive process that needs to be developed and refined for a particular field of engagement. So I think we do need to appreciate that.
And think of how many hours of lecture you received from your teachers, from your tutors, if you had tutors, from your parents, if they had to help you with your homework assignments. Think of how many hours you spent doing homework assignments. Think of how many subtraction problems you've solved in your entire schooling career.
Quite a few.
Hundreds? Thousands? So now you understand subtraction.
So
And maybe a
it's
few
basic.
higher level ideas within mathematics. Try to fathom how challenging that was for you to grasp that. Hold on. Got something stuck in my throat.
A little bit of water. It's all good.
Right?
Yeah.
So now imagine if I came to you and I was completely ignorant of mathematics. And you, let's say you graduated high school, and maybe hopefully by the end of high school you learned a little bit of calculus at the very least, or in university you did. And I start asking you, what's calculus? Tell me what calculus is. Tell me the essence of calculus. I want to understand. What would you tell me? Where would you even begin with that question? You see how tricky it is? Now, let's just assume that you are a calculus whiz. You aced all your calculus tests, and that, in fact, you became a calculus professor, and you do it for a living. So your understanding of calculus is just amazing. You understand every nuance of calculus, the history of calculus. You can solve these equations with your eyes closed. But that's not the problem. The problem is me. The problem is my ignorance when I ask you about calculus, because you can't start talking about calculus. You gotta go like down one level, and first you gotta teach me addition and subtraction, and then multiplication and division, and then equations with variables, x's and y's and z's, and then the quadratic equation, and then geometry, circles and squares and lines and this sorts of stuff, and then analytical geometry, charts and graphs and the unit circle, and then trigonometry, and then more advanced concepts, polynomials and functions, and all the different kinds of functions that exist and how they work.
And we can understand how this may also translate to other fields, right? Let's just say something like emotions or relationships, right? How do you explain the complexities of a familial relationship? So you have like a big family or something. How do you explain that sort of thing, and how all of the relationships interpenetrate and how everything is related to each other? How do you explain that without first explaining how one person relates to another single person, or how one kid relates to their parents, or how one person relates to themselves, and how a person can understand and feel their own emotions, right? So there's like a lot of foundations here. Now, I think he was being a little bit loose with the actual hierarchy that he laid out. I'm also being very loose with my hierarchy of displaying the emotional complexities that are needed to build up to understand, let's say, family relations. But we can appreciate still that there are many layers of understanding that need to go into this. And if we start to think about this and we go to another new field and we try to understand film, how do we understand film without first understanding how to make a good shot, like picture, good composition of a single shot? How do we understand film before we can understand that? And so on and so forth. And of course, obviously, moving on to spirituality, how do we just understand high-level spirituality without getting to the base level there and building up the foundations and really truly understanding it through and through? I think that's the point that we're making here.
And then maybe now we can have a discussion about calculus. And even then, it's not going to be a 5-minute discussion. You can't explain calculus in 5 minutes. And now I hear you saying, but Leo, I can find a YouTube video right now of somebody explaining calculus in 5 or 10 minutes.
But it's leveraging all of your information that you've already understood from high school. Right. But I guess you could just say the fundamental theorem of calculus and assume that people understand calculus from that. I guess they do understand the fundamental theorem, but that's not really understanding calculus. You'd have to leverage all of your information that you learned from school and growing up.
That's only because, yeah, you can find a video like that. You can always do a truncated explanation of anything. The problem is it going to be meaningful to the person learning it? And what level is the person learning it at? If you're in 12th grade math class and you've done all those other lower classes and you've done them well, then yeah, we can do a 10-minute little intro into calculus. But I mean, is that going to be enough for you to really understand the essence, the spirit, the core of calculus? No. I mean, yeah, you can do a little general explanation, but you're not going to really deeply grasp what derivatives are, what integration is, and all these other concepts from calculus. Mm-hmm. Because the way calculus works is that or mathematics in general, basically, is that it builds. It builds and builds and builds on top of itself. That's why it's so challenging, because you have to get the first layers right. And if there's any misunderstanding or confusion in the first layers, you can't go on to the next layers, which is why if you're failing your tests in school, they hold you back a grade.
I don't know if that's exactly why they hold you back a grade, but the point, we'll take the point as standing. And this is also why it's very difficult when we're learning these sort of, when we don't get a foundational understanding of each layer. So sometimes we get dumbed down explanations for something like, well, I guess in this analogy we're speaking here for mathematics. So somebody may get a sort of dumbed down explanation of arithmetic. And then when they go to algebra, they realize they haven't really understood arithmetic. So they had a bad understanding of arithmetic, and now they have to keep making a bad explanation. So they have to carry forward that sort of bad understanding into this bad understanding of algebra. And then that carries forward into a bad explanation or understanding of whatever is beyond algebra. I'm not entirely sure. Geometry, and then going beyond that into linear algebra and then differential equations and so on and so forth. You have to, there is a sort of a foundation that is necessary. But if you start to dumb down things, even at the lower levels, when you dumb those things down, that dumbed down explanation translates and carries forward into all of your future foundation, future building on the foundation. So that can be a problem. This becomes more of an issue for things like physics, because we don't feel comfortable speaking in more purely mathematical language. We don't feel comfortable with the sort of unintuitive things that happen in physics. So we give these really interesting explanations. We give interesting analogies. We give interesting and helpful ways of remembering some physics principles, but they are not entirely accurate. And that inaccuracy carries forward when we're trying to get into higher level physics. We kind of have to break down all of the misunderstandings that we had in earlier education, which can be a big problem. And yeah, these foundations are very important.
Because they know you won't be able to understand the more advanced material in the next grade unless you can have at least a basic level of comprehension of certain things. And so this is true of all science. Science is very deep and dense, and you got to learn it in little bits and pieces over hundreds and thousands of hours, over years and decades, and then you can have some sort of intelligent conversation about the function of nature or some aspect of nature. People take this for granted. People take this kind of schooling that we get for granted. We just sort of assume that these would be ideas that you would understand even if you didn't went to school. Mm-hmm. But you wouldn't. So any time that you're trying to ask a deep question about the nature of reality or yourself or life, the problem is how much foundation do you have to hear the answer? I can give you some very quick answers to very profound questions. Mm-hmm. because I do understand some of these topics. But the problem is not that. The problem, and this is really the thing that I spend the majority of my time racking my mind over in my life, is how do I bridge the gap between where I am and where you are?
It's a very difficult
Because if you
thing.
were where I'm at, you wouldn't need my explanation by definition. So if you're trying to learn from me, by definition, that assumes that I know something you don't know. Otherwise,
This is so important.
why are you listening to me?
This is so important, right? Because I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to break this apart or where the responsibility lies. I have like a rough understanding here, or a rough sort of heuristic, I guess, a way of going about it. But if you have a person who has a system, let's say Leo here, he has a way of engaging in the world. He has a particular language, so he has a way of communicating about it. But let's say he's not trying to teach anybody. I want to learn from him. I am trying to learn from him. My responsibility, if I'm trying to learn from Leo, is to drop all of what I am bringing, all of the baggage and all of the assumptions that I'm bringing to the table. I need to default to using his language because I'm trying to understand him. I need to use his language. So I need to make the extra effort to investigate all of the words that I use and see if they match all the words that he used, and always default to what he's using because I'm trying to understand what he's doing. So it's my responsibility. If I want to learn his system, I need to use his language. So this is important. But in another case where Leo is trying to teach people, and Leo, not trying to teach, let's say Leo is trying to spread his position. He's trying to convince people of his position. He's trying to change people's position to match his. In that case, he seems to have a responsibility of changing his language to match where other people are. So he needs to speak in the language that I would understand and then bring me over to where he is. But if we're just both trying to communicate with each other, that there's no clear understanding of exactly who at what point at exactly what time needs to be sticking to their definitions and staking a claim to their way of viewing the world and trying to share that, or where another person needs to be more flexible and so on. It's very difficult to understand who needs to be flexible at what point to actually grow and understand each other. So this is a very tough problem to have, especially when you're just teaching online. So some of his videos are just him presenting his own position. Some of his other videos are him trying to convince people and get them on board with his position. So he has different functions at different times. So sometimes he's going to be very strong in his own position, his own personal type of language, just presenting it to the world. And other times he's going to be kind of translating it to natural language and trying to pull people over. And that's going to get very confusing for some people. So how do you lay this all out? How do you lay it all up front? How do you help people understand what's happening and navigate the waters to actually facilitate effective communication? It's a very difficult problem.
And by the way, if you feel that you know more than me, then please stop watching. Please stop wasting your time listening to me. Mm-hmm. I know some of you like to hate watch me or whatever, and maybe you do that for entertainment's sake, but I would encourage you not to waste your life on that. Don't hate watch anybody. Don't waste your time watching stuff that you think is stupid. If you think what I'm saying is stupid or false or delusional, or you think that I'm wrong and that you know better than me about any of these questions, about science, about God, about psychedelics, about religion, about spirituality, about non-duality, about enlightenment, that's your prerogative. That's your perspective. That's your right to take that sort of position. But then why are you watching me? Don't waste your time. Go build your life. Be constructive. What I want for you is I want you to eliminate those aspects of your life that are not constructive and productive towards your life purpose or towards your happiness or towards your well-being or the health of yourself and everyone around you and society. See? So be very careful not to fall into this trap of hate watching stuff on YouTube. I know I fall into that trap too. Sometimes I'll hate watch some conservative political pundit or something just because it's so stupid. It's like looking at a car wreck. It's just like you can't help but look at it. But
Well, that's very kind of him to be relatable to the folks who hate watching him and trying to help guide us all to bettering our own lives and being more constructive. I really like this. I mean, it's nice of him to do that, and I want to push my own position here just to share with the world. Am I trying to convince people? I'm not sure if I'm presenting it or if I'm trying to convince. I don't know, but I'm just speaking my language here. I think if you're going around in the world and you see lots of people doing things ridiculous, so in his case, in Leo's case, he's looking at people who are conservative pundits and just kind of thinking that's all ridiculous, seeing it all as kind of silly nonsense. Or, for example, people who hate watching Leo and thinking that he's a crazy person. And essentially what happens is we go out into the world and we see lots of positions out there, and we see lots of them as being immature, underdeveloped positions. And I get the sense that if we look at other people's positions very often as immature and underdeveloped, that will lead to our own position being also immature and underdeveloped. If we start to look in the world and see other people's positions as being developed and quite mature, then that makes us investigate their position a little bit deeper, take it more seriously. It helps us refine our own positions in comparison to the two, and also refining our own position independently from the other, so that we can see more developed positions in the world and simultaneously develop our own view and positions on the world. It makes us more mature to see maturity. It makes us immature to go out and see only immaturity. And to do this sort of thing where we have this sort of slapstick confusion or anger response to everything in the world that's so ridiculous, that perpetuates that mindset and kind of makes our positions also become overly ridiculous and presents that ridiculousness outwards into the world. That's just what I think, at least.
recognize that that's a toxic tendency
It's
within
quite
your
toxic.
mind,
It's so
and that you can
toxic.
let that go, and you should be, as you're self-actualizing, you should be spending more and more of your mental energy concentrating it towards constructive, productive aims, whatever those are, whether it's your spiritual work or your business or whatever. But anyways, that was a tangent. So getting back to things. So where was I? So I can give you short, quick answers to very complicated, advanced questions. But the problem is that you're not going to understand the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of little simple adage that, well, if it can't be explained quickly and simply, that means the person explaining it doesn't understand. Well, that's one possibility. Consider the alternative possibility, which is that things can be explained very tersely, concisely, and simply, but that's going to pack a lot of information into a very dense symbolic form, whether it's a thought, a word, an equation, whatever. But then for you to really unpack that very much assumes that you already have a very deep foundation, as I do, and then we can communicate with very few words. In fact, really, if you were as conscious as me, we could literally just sit and look at each other, and that would be all that's necessary. Nothing would need to be said. For example,
You wouldn't even need to look at each other. You can just you can just experience the world, right? From the sort of spiritual nonsense worldview. You don't need to talk about anything, right? You can sit down and just enjoy life. And you don't even need to enjoy with your actual emotions or your feelings or whatever. All of that is incidental. It's all unnecessary extras. You don't need any of that. You're already there in infinite perfection. You don't need to talk about anything. You don't need to feel anything. You don't need to experience anything. You've already got all the answers. But that's just it's just one perspective here.
someone might ask, okay, Leo, what is reality? Tell me what reality is. I want to know what it is and where it came from and how it works and why it's here. You say you know, so why don't you tell me? Tell me simply. Tell me quickly. Okay, I can grant you your wish. Reality is infinity.
Done.
That's it. That's
Easy.
it. That's the whole answer. Nothing more needs to be said. Reality is infinity.
But notice how that's in his own personal siloed off. I'm being a little bit extreme by calling it personal, but this is a language that spiritual people will understand. A large group of like weirdos who are into consciousness work will understand that immediately. They get it. They don't need him to say it because they understand it already, right? So it's a language that people get. It's gotten. But if you're trying to talk and communicate to people who don't get it already, that's not going to make any sense. I can't just say that and expect anybody to understand it. So somebody's going to have to do the work of trying to translate that language to match natural language so other people can understand it. Somebody has to do the work, either the person speaking or the person listening. Somebody has to do it.
But do you have any clue what that actually means?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Of course not.
Most of you don't. Even if you think you do, you still don't. You have no clue how deep the answer is and how deep the question is. So this is a very common trap the mind falls into, is that the mind underestimates the depth of reality. And it tends to think that it can answer and understand questions about reality with simplistic answers. And then as you start to study these things, you realize just how little you knew. So this is just a general trend that you should notice throughout your entire life. This has happened to you. It's happened to all of us. We go into a situation and we think we know everything about that situation. The situation is simple, it's easy, we know all the answers, and then we start to study. And the more we study, the more we realize, damn, I was so deluded.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't even close to understanding this issue. I, of course, didn't have the answers at all. And the more I study, the less answers I have, the more questions I have, the more confused I get. Think of a time that this has happened to you. It especially happens when you try to accomplish something in life, like, for example, business.
Oh, yeah.
Or, for example, with capitalism. A lot of stage green socialist type people who lean towards sort of the socialist ideology, they will criticize capitalism a lot and business owners and CEOs and executives and this sort of stuff. But these people have never, the socialist type people, have never actually started their own business. And so when they do go to start their own business, they quickly realize just how difficult it is to start a business, how fierce the competition is, how much of a game of survival it is. And then you have two choices. Either you will say, fuck it, all this business stuff is just evil nonsense and I'm not even going to participate in this game, and then you just quit. And then you go just work for some employer.
And what an awful habit to develop, right? To neglect things that you're not good at. This is not a very good habit. This is a bad habit. We don't want to develop this. Now, it's fine to not do things that you're not good at, but to actively neglect them and to be so averse to them and completely drop something, it doesn't seem like a healthy way of going about it. And you don't want to do that. Please don't do that. Allow yourself to develop in all the different ways of engaging in the world, because there's so much more to the world than what we initially think there is to the world. We have a conception of the world, it's very limited, and we have other processes that engage with the world, but those are also very limited. And we want to be able to allow ourselves to expand and to process and engage in many, many other ways. Doesn't mean that you need to necessarily go to all the ways and divert all your energy into expanding in multiple different ways. All I'm really suggesting is that we don't neglect and we don't throw other systems out of engaging with the world. We don't invalidate other ways of engaging in the world. Just leave it as a possibility for you to develop and understand. Understand not being the right word, but develop. We'll stick with that one. As long as it's a possibility and we don't actively neglect these things, well, we can grow. And that sounds like a cool thing. To me, at least.
And then you're pissed off that this employer is exploiting you and, not paying you your fair share and all this sorts of stuff. Or you can actually have a a moment of epiphany. You can realize, wait a minute, the simplistic ideas I had about socialism and capitalism and that I'm being exploited and all this sort of stuff, it's not so simple, because actually to succeed in business requires a sort of brutalness. It's a game of survival. It's very much like being a lion out on the safari hunting for zebras or antelope. That's a brutal business. It's a business of survival. And just because you go work at Starbucks or some other place for some employer, that doesn't mean you've escaped that problem. You've just sort of ignored taking responsibility for it, actually. Because see, now you can be pissed off at your boss for being the evil capitalist who exploits you without realizing that the boss has to be doing the things he's doing. Otherwise, the company's going to go out of business because of the competition. So if you actually take on the responsibility and the challenge, you might say, I had some overly simplified ideas about what socialism and capitalism are, and maybe capitalism isn't so evil, and maybe profit is not some evil, but it's actually sort of a necessary thing in order to run a successful business. And maybe business and corporations aren't evil in their essence, but it's just actually how human beings survive at this point in our development. And it's sort of a necessary evil. And maybe I'm involved in this necessary evil in a much deeper way than I thought. Maybe I'm not separate from it. And see, now you get a more real sense for economics. It's not just simplistic theories that you learned in college by reading a few books. Now you're really in the thick of it. Well, it's likewise with stuff like trying to understand consciousness or meditation or psychedelics.
Right. It's just like that. And before we go into that, I'd like to hammer down, well, not hammer down, but emphasize a little bit with the point about economics and this simplistic view, and maybe you are a socialist and you have these socialist ideals and a socialist view on profit and exploitation of labor and so on and so forth. But then you have this other process of understanding how our culture works currently and how our society is run currently. And I don't think that there needs to be any sort of destructive truth here or any sort of destructive position. You can hold both of these simultaneously, or not necessarily simultaneously. You can develop them independently, however you want to phrase it. You can have the idea that profit is death and that whatever socialists think, I don't really know the ins and outs of socialism, but you can have a simplistic idea of socialism and view the world in that sense, but then you can go into business and understand that it's actually more complicated, and if we need our society to run, then we have to engage with some of these things. He's calling it a necessary evil, that's his language, he can call it that. You can understand that and then develop your worldview in building a business and working with the world and engaging with the world as it currently is without destroying the initial underdeveloped potentially, but the initial worldview that you had about socialism. So you can still develop your socialist worldview and also develop your worldview of understanding capitalism or understanding how business works in our modern world. And they don't need to conflict with each other. Sometimes it may be more effective to work with this socialist understanding and socialist framing of the world, and other times it may be more effective to work within this sort of normal capitalist understanding and framing of the world. They don't need to fight. One doesn't need to override the other. When you start to learn about business, it doesn't mean you need to throw out all of your socialist ideals. Socialism may be the most natural thing that you think is most important. It may be a more effective way of running our society in the future. Once you develop that understanding there, you can spread a little bit better. But you can still engage with the world as it is currently. And this is going to be extended a little bit into consciousness work, right? So you can understand science really well, and then you can start meditating, and then you can say, oh my gosh, reality isn't even real, or whatever meditators might say. And that doesn't mean that you need to stop doing science anymore. It doesn't mean you throw out all of your intellectualism. It doesn't mean that. You can still develop your you can still develop your science and still have a full understanding of the physical world as it is naturally, normally described, and also develop your consciousness work in whatever way you develop your consciousness work. They don't need to fight. They are not at odds with each other.
or with science, trying to understand what science is. See, most people think they know what science is, and they're very cocky and arrogant about it. And if I try to teach them a little bit deeper the complexities of science and some of the limitations of science, they start to get very arrogant and defensive about it. And of course, that's projected like onto me as like, oh, Leo, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, but see, I spent 20 years contemplating the epistemics and metaphysics of science, more than most professional scientists have. Whereas you, how many years have you spent contemplating the nature of science? If I had to bet, I would say less than a year.
It's super important to recognize that what he's describing, Leo generally talks about the nature of science. So I don't know if we have a particular language for this or a name for describing that, but it's more like meta science. It's not science, it's meta science in a sense. I don't know what the philosophical classifications for all these things are specifically, but it's a meta scientific sort of thing, or it's philosophy of science, which is very, very different from science, right? To engage with science is not the same as engaging with the philosophy of science. So a person who is a professional scientist does not know anything about the philosophy of science. And in the case here of Leo, a person who is studying the philosophy of science doesn't know science. And they don't need to fight each other. There's no conflict here at all. You don't need to understand the philosophy of science to do science. Then you don't need to know science to do the philosophy of science. They may help each other in some ways. They may help get over some issues. It is unfortunate when scientists start trying to do philosophy of science and they haven't studied that. It is very unfortunate when people who are doing consciousness work or doing philosophy of science or doing some meta science, or sometimes they call it metaphysics, whatever. People are doing that sort of things and they start trying to invade in the realm of actual science. That's a big problem. We don't want to have these things conflict with each other. They're different fields. They just refer to different things. They're not tied in any way. Well, okay, they're tied in some important ways, but they're not tied in the ways that may seem like they're obviously tied. Knowing one doesn't know the other. Having statements about meta science doesn't really change science in any way at all. They're just separate.
So the challenge with me helping you understand what science is and understanding some of its limitations is you're missing 19 years of contemplation and study and reading. I didn't just contemplate, I read books. I listened to lectures. I studied science and thought about it deeply in university. I took philosophy of science courses. I took logic courses. And I struggled through all that for years, for decades, and then contemplated, and then read philosophy, and read famous scientists, read about Einstein, read about Descartes, read about Leibniz, studied their work, thought about their work, considered the limitations of their work, right? How much of that have you done? So if you haven't done any of that, how do I communicate with you?
Mm-hmm.
That's the challenge. That's the bottleneck. The bottleneck is a lack of foundation. Therefore, my videos are oftentimes about building that foundation. And building that foundation takes time and effort that most people don't have, especially on YouTube.
Unfortunately, we don't.
In general, this is a general psychological principle of human beings, is that human beings are very bad at building foundations for anything. Because building a foundation for anything requires a lot of time and forward thinking and patience and daily follow through. For you to understand some advanced mathematical concepts took 12 years of building a foundation. And
The Dalai Lama is a scientist. Oh, what kind of scientist is the Dalai Lama?
now you just take the foundation for granted, and now we can have a conversation about some advanced mathematical concepts.
Consciousness scientist?
But that's not the case, for example, with consciousness. You did not spend 12 years building a foundation of understanding what consciousness is, or what psychedelics are, or what science is. Now you might say, Leo, no, I spent 12 years studying science. Yeah, you spent 12 years reading about scientific discoveries. You did not spend 12 years doing science. In fact, I'm willing to bet you haven't done a single science experiment in your entire life. Now you must,
Okay, this is a silly thing to say. Yeah, I wish he would explain what he means. I think he's going to explain it, I guess, by giving examples of something. I don't know how this is going to work, but it'd be nice if he were to more explicitly describe what he means by science, to say that we've never done a science experiment in our lives. Obviously, it's nobody, well, most people haven't done some sort of unique scientific investigation in their lives that have been put into the scientific literature and peer reviewed and so on and so forth. Most people haven't. But a person who is doing a science experiment in their class, which is just kind of repeating what other people have done, that's sort of a science experiment in some sense. So it kind of depends on what sense you mean is doing science. Is doing science investigating something uniquely and then putting it to peer review? Well, that seems to be definitely science. But is copying what somebody else did and put into peer review, is that also doing science? Well, that's a part of the peer review, right? So you're part of the peer review process. So you're doing science. Sort of. So it kind of depends on what he means here. I feel like he's being deliberately inflammatory when he says it like this. I understand the point, though. Maybe it's effective for some people to understand.
say, oh, Leo, but in high school chemistry class, they made me do some experiments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they made you like a monkey follow through some steps that they wrote in a manual. You went through those steps, you did something, you don't even remember what you did or how you did it or why it was even being done.
He's being deliberately inflammatory. I love it.
You did that just to get a grade and to pass the test.
So I would like to hear if he means that to do something for some other reason is not meaning that you're not doing it for science, right? So what reasons would be acceptable, or which reasons would line up with doing science and which reasons would not line up with doing science? If you're doing something in order to perpetuate the species, is that doing science or is that doing pragmatism? That's how I may phrase it. You're just doing pragmatism. You're just trying to survive. You're just doing survival. You're not doing science. You're doing survival. And in this case, if you're doing something that looks like science from some perspective, but you're actually just doing it to get a grade, well, you're just doing schoolwork. You're just trying to get grades. You're not doing science at all. But then when you start doing science and you're getting paid for it, now are you now just doing financial things? Are you just getting money and not doing science? Does that same thing follow? I think Leo would probably agree with that. If you're doing science and you're getting some sort of monetary benefit from it, you're not doing science anymore. You're doing something that looks like science from some perspectives, but really, you're just making money. You're doing finances. Interesting. I don't think this is... I like this worldview. I think it's an interesting worldview. I would probably think more in terms of this. I don't think most people would think in terms of this. It's kind of a silly way of presenting or trying to convince somebody to believe his position if he's just presenting it as this way. But we'll give him a chance to explain himself a bit.
You didn't actually genuinely do any science in your entire life, and yet you think you understand science. See?
I see.
And even if you did do some science, that doesn't mean you've actually deeply contemplated the epistemics and metaphysics of what you were doing. You can do great lab work like a monkey, where somebody tells you that they need some chemical reaction made, and you go look up in a book what of chemical reactions. You look through a catalog of those reactions. You find the reactions that are necessary to achieve the result somebody wants, your employer wants, let's say, and you go mix those chemicals together and you generate a result, and then you give it to them, and then they're happy or whatever, and good.
Can I just stand up for monkeys for a moment? Okay, monkeys are cool too. There's nothing wrong with being a monkey. Monkeys are innocent. Monkeys are valuable. Monkeys are loving people or entities. How do you refer to... Anyway, monkeys are cool in my book. They get the thumbs up, okay? I like monkeys. We don't need to insult people by comparing them to monkeys. Monkeys are innocent. I just want to throw it out there. Monkeys are nice.
But while you were doing that, you didn't think deeply about what are chemicals?
What are chemicals?
Where did they come from? How do they work? How do we even know chemicals exist, really? Maybe they're just hallucinations of the mind. You didn't ask any of these questions because it wasn't relevant to achieving some result that you were paid for or some grade that you were supposed to receive. There wasn't even time to ask these questions. In fact, if you were asking these questions, this would get you a lower grade. This would get you less money, less success. Why? Because asking these questions oftentimes isn't practical and it slows you down.
Yes, and it shows that you haven't internalized all of the assumptions necessary to proceed in science. Right? Any sort of way of engaging in the world has a bunch of assumptions rolled into it, and if you start to question the assumptions, you are no longer engaging in the world in the proper way. Now you've gone meta, whatever it is that you're referring to. So if I'm trying to engage with beauty, I just engage with beauty. If I'm trying to investigate beauty, I am no longer engaging with beauty. I am now doing meta aesthetics as opposed to doing aesthetics, which is a whole completely different way of engaging in the world, in which case I'm engaging in the wrong way, dock points, get less money, throw them out of the institution, so on and so forth. That's at least my way of viewing what is happening here. If you're just questioning all of the ideas of science, you're no longer engaging in science, you're doing meta science or you're doing philosophy of science, however you want to phrase that. So throw them out. No points for you. You're asking the wrong type of questions. You're not engaging in the world in the way that we're trying to develop currently.
If you have to question everything you're doing all the time at a deep metaphysical, philosophical level, it's hard to achieve anything. Because like if you want to go drive to the grocery store and you walk outside and you're getting into your car and then suddenly it hits you like, wait a minute, what is a car? Where did this car come from? Who built it? How did it get here? Where did the technology of it come from? And you start to deeply question this sorts of stuff. And you start to question what is metal that it's made out of? Where did the rubber in the tires come from? You will spend a whole day just questioning this car and you will not drive to the grocery store. And then your kids will go hungry.
How horrible. Don't do that.
You see?
I see, yes.
So once you recognize that there's a big difference between doing stuff and actually getting to the bottom of it through contemplation,
Very, very different.
thinking deeply about it. The majority of humans don't think deeply about anything. They don't think about anything. They're just like monkeys walking around doing stuff that is acceptable in their culture and that their culture tells them to do.
Okay, he's attacking the monkeys again. What did the monkeys do to him? Monkeys ain't done nothing to you, Leo. So, okay, we don't want to, well, I don't want to personally get into this mode of disparaging other people who have differing ways of operating in the world, right? We have our things that we like to care about and we like to develop, and they have their things that they like to care about and they like to develop, right? We have different emphases. Hopefully, I like to encourage everyone to be open to develop all fields of study. And obviously, they care about the ones that they care about most, and they can emphasize the ones that they emphasize the most. That's totally acceptable. But they also are available to develop all the other fields of study. So A-okay for me if you don't want to think about things very deeply. Just engage in your science. Just engage in your driving a car. That's totally fine. You don't need to care about the nature of cars or the nature of metal or whatever it is. So I personally would like to counter encourage this sort of disparaging of people who are engaging in the world differently than in the way that we like to engage in the world. Everyone has different emphases, but every way of engaging is acceptable and they can be developed. That's how I'd like to put it. Just want to give that a little bit of counter signal here.
So going back to the point of this problem that human beings are very poor at building foundations for things. The only reason you developed a foundation for mathematics, for science, for language, for other things you learned in school is because school is a system that forced you. This was a system that, recognize how powerful this is. School is a bureaucratic system that was invented over a course of, let's say, the last 2,000 years. Went through a deep evolutionary process. First, maybe it started as tutoring, like in the ancient Roman times and Greek times. It was just tutoring, one-on-one instruction. Then classrooms were developed. Then these classrooms grew into larger schools. Then these schools grew into universities. Then these universities, turned into entire businesses and corporations with giant bureaucracies and funding and a bunch of other things. And there were all these different subjects and different experiments were done onto, how do you teach kids which way, which learning.
Oh, I'm getting. Wait, am I? Was there a little cutting out there for a second? We had a little bit of a little choppy there for a moment, Leo. Not sure why. But yeah, so we got to explain this, like hammer it home that a lot of people were just forced. I mean, most people were just forced. We're all just kind of forced in order to engage in the world in some ways that other people were trying to tell us to engage in the world. I think this is very, 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 very not good. Not good. I don't like this at all. I don't like it at all. Not one bit. But there are many ways to engage in the world, and hopefully we can all find the ones that we like the most and have a society help us develop those things that we like. And also have the availability to develop in other ways. But I don't think everyone needs to learn everything. And not everyone needs to develop all the things that are forced upon us in school. But that's just my own personal opinion and so on. Would I also encourage mindfulness? So I encourage mindfulness because I like mindfulness personally. I think it's pretty cool. I'm a big fan. I like to meditate very often. I do it every single day. I think it's a great habit. I would encourage it. But I can understand that other people don't need to develop that. I don't think everybody needs to develop it. It'd be nice if everybody understands that they can develop it and that it's an option available to them. And it'd be nice if people didn't neglect it, because there are a lot of people who sort of actively try not to meditate or actively reject this sort of, let's just say psychological development. So I don't want to necessarily call it spiritual. It's not always spiritual. But, people don't like to work on their psychological development. They also don't care to do their spiritual development. And they kind of do it in such a way that they're kind of neglecting it. It seems not that they think it's an option available to them. They kind of reject it wholesale. I don't like this rejection. But if somebody's not terribly interested in developing their mindfulness, okay, let it develop sometimes naturally as it develops. No need to focus on it. Focus on whatever it is that you like. All roads lead to heaven. You can develop whatever you want. It's not really necessary to be mindful in this sort of psychological or the spiritual way that is generally encouraged by me or by most people who try to develop mindfulness. That's what I'd say.
Styles are better suited to what people, and then tests were developed and a base of knowledge was, this took thousands of years to develop this. Mm-hmm. And then we forced everybody to go to school for 12 years.
Wow.
You didn't have a choice about that as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
You just went. And that forced this foundation upon you. But imagine trying to achieve that with something that is outside of the school system, outside the school curriculum, by yourself. Imagine if you had to teach yourself mathematics completely by yourself without any support systems from your culture or your society.
Seems difficult.
Imagine you grew up in a society where mathematics didn't exist. Or it existed, but only a few fringe people knew about it. Like maybe 1 in 1,000 people knew about mathematics, but the rest of them didn't. Your family didn't, your friends didn't, your colleagues didn't. And then one of those fringe 1 in 1,000 people tried to teach you mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
How would that go? How would he even introduce the idea of mathematics to you? Because in the world you grew up in, people weren't even talking about it as a legitimate subject. In fact, maybe they were talking about it as some sort of witchcraft or superstition. After all, what is mathematics? It's some sort of woo-woo ideas in your mind. It's just philosophy and nonsense that some stupid mathematician invented. It doesn't do anything. It's just ideas and mental masturbation. Imagine if that was the attitude of your culture.
Right? See, this is what I'm talking about here. When your culture or when you have had this idea of neglecting certain things or being very averse to certain things, man, it's going to be very difficult to develop in that field, obviously. Right? It's a little bit easier if you're open to the development. It's still very difficult to try to drop all of your language and all of your assumptions to engage in the way that the person is trying to communicate to you and really fully get into that mode of being. That's going to be a little bit difficult for most people, but that's going to be impossible if you begin to neglect it, or if you think of it as something that's bad, if you think of it as witchcraft or whatever he likes to go by and call it bad, and whatever language he likes to use there. So man, it's a very difficult situation to be in. You have to have this openness to understand that there are other forms of development. There are other ways of engaging in the world, and you too can engage in that way. Don't need to, but it's available to you. I think this is very important. In Arabic, Hawaiian, Inuit, and other indigenous cultures, the same word for breathe and soul are used. Oh, breathe and soul are one word. Interesting. When does the same word of soul, of the world? Your Hawaiian mentor says that breathe is mindfulness, awareness of your breath, and interconnectedness of the soul of the world. Wow, that's beautiful. I like the connection of breath and wind together. And of course, to pay attention to your breath is mindfulness. Is usually one of the first steps for a lot of people engaging in mindfulness. That's very cool. I like it a lot. Awareness of your breath and the interconnectedness of the soul of the world. Yeah, you can see, is there really a difference between your own breath and the wind and all the other processes in the world? It's a good way of looking at it, definitely.
And then some mathematician came to you and started to actually seriously try to explain some mathematics to you, like trigonometry. How would that go? Can you anticipate how stuck you would be?
Yes.
But imagine you somehow recognize the validity and the value and importance of mathematics, and you started learning it by yourself. Imagine how difficult that would be compared to the way you learned it in school. Because in school you had to go, there was math class, there was a bell that rang, and you were like a herd animal. You were literally like a factory farmed cow, just going wherever, whatever path they led you down, learning whatever they told you to learn. You didn't ask any questions about, why am I learning this? Should I be learning this? Is this even true what I'm being taught? Where did these ideas come from? None of these ideas entered your mind when you were young. You were just learning stuff blindly, like a monkey. Jumping through hoops, passing grades and tests.
Yep.
But imagine if you had to develop mathematics on your own. This would mean you would have to set aside time every day where you would say, okay, for the next hour or two, I'm learning mathematics, I'm reading books, and then I'm going to spend a few more hours later in the day doing homework assignments, these different exercises. I'm going to do 50 or 100 of these long division problems. And then after you do that for a few weeks, then you move on to the next chapter of the book and the next topic, and then you learn that for another few, and then you keep doing that, and you do that for 12 years, every single week for 12 years. How many of you would actually succeed in that? Less than 1 in a million.
It's hard to keep up.
Why? Because simply, for us humans, mostly what we're not doing anything original. We're just following the herd. Whatever our friends and family and colleagues are doing is what we do. And anything too far outside of that is extremely difficult for us to do, because we have to isolate ourselves from the herd and devote ourselves to this task and be very focused about it, be very serious about it, and be very persistent with it despite failure and difficulty. And you have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing yourself. Most people are so bad at motivating and pushing themselves or creating a long-term vision or plan for themselves, they can't even plan 1 year into the future, let alone 12 years. Think about how much vision it takes just to say to yourself, you know what? I'm going to spend the next 12 years learning mathematics, and maybe it'll get me somewhere. Maybe it'll have some value for me. And that means I'm going to have to wake up every morning thinking about mathematics, reminding myself to sit down for an hour, read the book, reminding myself to sit down later in the day, do homework assignments, even though they're painful and complicated and confusing. And maybe I don't enjoy it that much, but I'm gonna keep doing that for 12 fucking years, and it'll get me somewhere. Only 1 in a million people has enough vision and motivation and self-discipline and follow through capacity to actually execute that.
This is a very, I mean, I like this a lot. This is a very good reminder for me to appreciate the amount of work it takes to develop other alternate ways of viewing the world or engaging in the world. So you're engaging in the world in this mathematical way, you have to really build it up. We talked earlier a little bit about how it takes a long time for kids to understand narrative, to understand what stories are. It takes them a long time. They have to watch a lot of dumb children's stories. You've seen children's stories before. They're really dumbed down. They're very, very simple. They explain the story all the way through. Every single step of the way, the story is re-explained to the kid so they can understand what a story is. And it takes them a long time to grasp that. And then at some point they get to more complicated narratives, and then more and more complicated and more complicated. And that takes several years of hours a day of trying to understand and trying to develop that. And if we're trying to develop something independently, whether it's independent or not, it's going to take a long time. So if we're trying to understand the sort of spiritual worldview, or trying to develop our spirituality or our consciousness work, however we want to phrase this type of thing that we're talking about here, it's going to take a long time. It's not going to be a simple process. Even if we want to develop something very basic like understanding art or seeing beauty in the world, that also may take a very, very long time to refine and develop. So it's a good reminder for us all, I think, at least for me personally, to see how much work it may take to develop any particular way of engaging in the world. I really appreciate that if we're trying to be open to other ways of engaging.
To actualize that. The only reason mathematics is so widespread is because there was a system that you went through like a sheep to teach you that, to force you into that. And you wanted to quit. And if it was left up to you, you would have quit mathematics very early on. The only reason you persisted is because your parents forced you, your culture and society expected it of you, and you were given no other options. Mm-hmm. It was not a choice you had. And then in a sort of certain sense, it became easy. When you don't have a choice about something, it's actually easy to do it. But it's really hard to do something when you have an infinite number of choices and possibilities. When you can go have sex, socialize, watch TV, YouTube, play video games, when you have all these options, who's going to learn math? Nobody. The only people who are going to learn math are those who are forced into a system that forces them to learn it. That's the only reason people, by and large, understand math.
But surely there are some people who really like math. I'm going to go on a limb here. I'm guessing there are some people who would really take to math and want to understand and develop that worldview for themselves. But of course, it will be a small amount of people. So the point that he's making is very strong here, and I think it stands a lot. But there are going to be some people who will definitely develop math. Hello, good morning. I think there are quite a few people who would take the time to try to learn math, but not as many people as do know math currently, of course.
And even so, even if you went through 12 years of that, your understanding of math is still piss poor. Mm-hmm. For most of you.
Absolutely.
The way that science and mathematics works is that it builds very much like imagine a giant redwood tree. A thick tree with many, many rings that are built, right? And the reason that a tree has rings in it is because every year or so, every season, the tree expands, kind of going from the inside to the outside, and it builds layers, and it accretes layer upon layer upon layer. So really what you have in an old tree is you have sort of a nested Matryoshka doll effect of smaller trees as it was growing up and out of itself.
It's a really dumbed down explanation of it. I think it's fine. Maybe we'll let it slide for this analogy here, but that's not the greatest explanation of it. But it's let's see what the analogy is first before we try to take down the analogy. I don't think it's necessary to take down an analogy, but that's not a great explanation. It's an acceptable explanation, but it's not a great explanation.
And you can't just have the outer layer of a tree. That outer layer depends upon the inner layer, and that one depends upon the previous one, and so on. And that's how human knowledge and science and mathematics and so forth work.
That's how science and mathematics work. Okay, I think we'll accept it. Okay, it's not necessary for us to get into the seasons changing and the resin canals and so on and so forth of trees changing sizes based on the seasons, and that's how rings are created. I guess we don't need to necessarily get into the specifics of all that. We'll just allow this to go past. Yeah, you need the foundations, you need the inner things to support the outer things. I think we can allow that. We'll allow it.
Now, the topics that I cover are topics that have been neglected by our education system.
Yes. Absolutely.
Topics like self-actualization, philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, psychology, sociology, developmental psychology. The philosophy and methods of science, consciousness, psychedelics, spirituality, religion, mysticism. Topics like success, emotional mastery, leadership, creativity, how to discipline and motivate yourself, life purpose, how to find your values, how to self-reflect, how to contemplate, how to think deeply and independently about things for yourself, how to deconstruct your own mind and reality, love, wisdom, you spent virtually zero time studying any of these topics in school or in university. You might say, oh, Leo, no, but I took a psychology class in high school, and I studied some psychology or sociology in college, and I did some study of physics and science in college, and I took a few intro philosophy courses in college.
Yeah, I took a couple philosophy classes in college. I took I think 2 psychology classes. Took a couple quantum physics or modern physics classes. Yeah, sort of. I took a film class. Yeah, so I know everything about it from those few classes, but that doesn't compare at all to the amount of effort that it was necessary to build up my understanding of calculus, for example, or any mathematics. And that obviously doesn't compare to the amount of effort that was necessary to learn language. The language is a little different because we can acquire languages very quickly, so maybe that's not an apt comparison here. But it doesn't compare to the amount of work that I've taken to actually understand any of the other fields that have been much more deeply understood, or at least much more thoroughly attempted to understand a broader breadth of. One class of psychology isn't going to cut it. Ain't going to do it.
Yeah, maybe you did, but all of that is just like it's so minuscule. It's so minuscule, and it was so poor in quality, and the amount of effort and thought that you put into it was so little compared to what is necessary to really, truly, deeply understand these things. So my job is to help you to understand these things that are outside the norms of our current education system. And our education system is very limited precisely because it ignores these topics. Now you might say, oh, Leo, that sucks. Why doesn't education just include these important topics? If they're so important, why wouldn't education include them? Leo, isn't that an argument against their importance? Because I mean, honestly, if these things were so important, like if consciousness was truly so important, if love was so important, if truth was so important, surely there would be classes on these things
Interesting.
early in school and all throughout.
Why can't they?
But there aren't.
Why aren't they?
Therefore, these things must be bullshit or nonsense or unimportant. But what you don't understand is that the education system is deeply political. The things that the education system teaches, I'm not saying it's political in the sense that it makes you a conservative or a liberal. I'm saying that it's political in the sense that ideas are dangerous and scary things, threatening things. They are threatening to power and they are threatening to social order. So what you think of here, these topics, as just being ideas, as just being philosophy, as just being mere curiosities, they're not that. Precisely what separates the topics that I just mentioned, that I talk about so much and that I am passionate about the most, is that they are deeply, deeply functional. They play a crucial role in one's survival. And as a result, they're very dangerous. They threaten the social order, and because they threaten the social order and they threaten power hierarchies, they threaten how society is structured. They threaten the economy.
Interesting.
They threaten religion. They threaten science. They threaten technology. They threaten the traditional family. They threaten culture. Because they threaten these things, it becomes virtually impossible to get the general population to agree to teach these things in school.
It's very difficult because a lot of those fields that you laid out there have this sort of thing that I don't really know how to describe it properly, but I'm going to call it destructive truth for the moment. They have these truths that are true, and they're true in such a way that necessarily nothing else can be true. Does that make sense? It's a destructive truth. So one, for example, if you find that reality is real in some sort of scientific sense, we can talk about physical reality, and this is scientifically, it's all real. That reality necessarily invalidates any other type of reality. So if I say that I can sense different things that are not a part of the scientifically defined senses or scientifically validated senses, then I must be wrong, because the scientific truth is destructively true over my truth or over any other perspective. My truth is not quite the right way of putting that. So any other perspective is wrong compared to the perspective that is giving out to science. And obviously this translates to other things where he mentioned religion. Also, it's a huge one, obviously. The religious truth is going to be true, and it's going to say that necessarily every other conflicting religion is not true. So it's a destructive type of truth. And it's not allowing for other people to have different perspectives. So if we're teaching people how to do something like pay attention to their emotions or learn about love or something like that, that's going to necessarily conflict with, not necessarily, but oftentimes it's going to conflict with some sort of physical perspective of the world or some sort of scientific perspective of the world. And since these things conflict, the scientific perspective, having destructive truth, is going to invalidate this sort of emotionality oftentimes. So if we can develop some worldview that doesn't have these sort of destructive truths, then it would be a lot easier for us to have people develop in ways that are different than natural, different than what is being taught currently. If we have people who can develop in ways that are emotional development or develop in ways that are spiritual development, and it doesn't necessarily have to conflict and invalidate science. It doesn't have to necessarily conflict and invalidate religion. It doesn't have to necessarily conflict and invalidate technology or whatever other forms of development that we find socially acceptable. Then we can all grow in all of our different ways and develop in all of our special ways and not necessarily invalidate other things. But that's a very difficult thing for a lot of people. Some people don't like this alternate perspectives, not having destructive types of truths. again, I need to figure out better language for that. I'm not sure how to phrase that properly, but it's something that's not quite appreciated. If I find something beautiful, everyone must find it beautiful. Just to give a ridiculous example where it obviously shouldn't, we can understand very cleanly that that shouldn't be the case. If I find something beautiful, it must be real. Why? Why does it need to be real? Who cares if it's real, if it's beautiful? Beauty and reality don't need to mesh at all. Beauty is not destructive in that way. Beauty is not going to invalidate reality. But reality may invalidate beauty. For a lot of people, some people don't accept the beauty of something that isn't real because this sort of, their perspective is sort of destructive. It invalidates other perspectives. Anyway, I'm falling off into a tangent that's not quite well articulated, so we'll continue. Hey, disciple, what's up?
If the things that I taught would be taught in school, the teachers who would be teaching these things would probably be, at the very least, outcast from society and demonized, but they might even have violence done to them and even killed.
Wow.
That's the seriousness of what we're talking about. Now, sure, you can teach these topics in a shallow way, which is not too threatening. But if you teach these topics in a very deep way, and especially when you start to interconnect them all together in a holistic way to build a big picture understanding of what's really going on in reality and in life, that's where it gets very, very threatening. And in general, this is why school doesn't teach you to question anything deeply for yourself. It's mostly just memorization. That's mostly what school is. It's just memorization. And then regurgitation of what you memorized. That's not a true understanding of anything. It's not really learning. It's just indoctrination and dogma. It doesn't matter whether the content that you're being indoctrinated with is scientific or not. You're still being indoctrinated with it, and it's still therefore dogma and belief. Now, it's precisely because these topics are so important that they are not covered. Do you see? Because the most important topics are the ones that relate to survival. The most important questions are the ones that most people in society don't want you asking. Because when the majority of your culture and your society is built upon constructed fantasies and illusions that are designed for the perpetuation of the human race, for survival, when that is the primary paradigm from which society operates, when your concerns are things like money and sex and material advancement and technology, and the preservation of your career, and your family, and your religion, and your tribe, when these are your primary concerns in life, there can be no deep questioning because you're not really interested in truth. You're not interested in understanding anything. You're interested in just maintaining patterns of survival. Most people are not interested in questioning or deconstructing their religion or what their professors are teaching in university or the way that business is conducted or their tribe, their political party, their nation. When they're teaching you history in school, they're not interested in teaching you in an unbiased history which spans the entire globe. They are interested in teaching you the history of your people. That's what you were taught in university or in high school, is the history of your people, not the world. You got a very biased history of your little, starting from your little local region of the globe. You didn't learn the history of Australia, if you're not Australian. You didn't learn the history of Japan. You didn't learn the history of China. You didn't learn the history of New Zealand. You didn't learn the history of most countries on the planet, mostly just your own.
True.
And then whatever entanglements your country had with other countries, that's what you were taught. And even that was taught from a very self-biased perspective, where your country was placed on a pedestal and all the other ones were marginalized and diminished. You see? And now to go into the school system and to suggest, hey, let's change the way we teach history. In America, in American schools, let's not teach about George Washington and about Thomas Jefferson and the Constitution, the Revolution. Let's not teach about that. Let's focus on the entire world evenly. Let's teach them about Australia. Let's teach them about Japan. What would happen? There would be an outcry. There would be absolute outcry from the parent, the parent association that governs the school. There would be an outcry like, how dare you teach my children about those black savages in Africa? They need to learn about good old Western civilization. That's the response you would get in many districts across America. How dare you teach Australian history before American history? Because American history is more important than Australian history. That would be the kind of logic.
Wow.
And it would be very threatening for the parents, because whatever the kids learn, the kids have to come back to their parents at the end of the day. And then the kid is sitting at the dinner table, and the parent asks the kid, of course, well, say, what did you learn in school today? And then the kid is going to say something like, well, I learned that, for example, in the Middle East, they had advanced civilizations that were more developed than Western European civilization during certain periods, like the Islamic Golden Age. They had more advanced mathematics. They had more sophisticated universities and other things like that. They were more open-minded, more multicultural than some of us even are today. And then when the conservative parent who didn't learn these things hears about this stuff, this conflicts with the parents' worldview, and their worldview is a sort of nationalistic one of like,
destructive truth.
Dandy, Uncle Sam, we're the best, America's the best, America's the greatest, Western civilization is the greatest. This sort of, they have that kind of worldview, and now this clashes with their worldview, and they say, wait a minute, what are these teachers teaching my children? Filling their mind with all this anti-American stuff about Islam being great at one point. This is all, they're all a bunch of terrorists and stuff.
Why do we have this issue? Why do we need our country to be the best? Why do we need everything to be the best? It's not necessary. It's not necessary. And it's definitely not necessary for everything to be the best at all times. Things can be developing, things can be changing, things can be in flux. Not everything needs to be number one. Let's get beyond that. So it's very difficult to, and also he's going into history here, and he's not explaining even further into how it's difficult to explain history simply, because not everything can be explained very simply. And we have history, there's a lot of bias in determining what is important, which facts are important, right? You're not just laying out every single fact of the entire universe from the beginning up until now, from every single perspective of the world. We're not just laying out all the facts, we're doing a little bit of triage, right? We're explaining about the facts of human civilization and history, and then we're ignoring 99% of the people's perspectives. We don't care about much of the peasants or all the other, I don't know we're not caring about most of the people. We're caring about things on civilization levels, or on the level of kingdoms. Is that what I'm calling it? I'm not sure how to describe that. Societies, how societies are interacting with each other. But we're not really caring about how individuals were in that time. And it obviously would be very overwhelming to try to document every single person's interactions throughout history, throughout all time, and call that history. So we're doing so much triage, and there's going to be lots of bias. And even that process of trying to determine which parts are important for people to understand, and why is it important for people to understand. There's too much to go into this. But we have to understand that there's so many assumptions that are being laid out when we learn the history of our particular region. and we're not learning the full history of the world. We're not learning the full history of humanity. We're getting very, very broad strokes, which are not very descriptive, not very accurate, not the full picture. So we can see that and recognize that. And hopefully we're not threatened when other people give us histories of Islam and the great civilizations that may have been there. And that doesn't need to conflict or threaten our valuing of American civilization today. That seems so, well, it's unfortunate that would question at all our value of what we have today, that other things were great before, or that other things are great now. That doesn't make us need to change our value system or what it is that we like currently. You can like your thing, and other things can be better in different ways of evaluating it. It's fine if other things are more multicultural or more accepting or more technologically advanced. You can still like your nation. You don't need to switch over to something that's the best and some way that other people want you to value them. You don't need to value multiculturalism or technical advancement and change which countries you find most valuable based on that. You can use whatever system you like to evaluate. And if you just like your country, you don't need to switch over to liking the Islamic countries for being more technologically advanced in the past. We don't need this destructive viewpoint. I hope that point is being made.
That's how the parents might think, if they're very ignorant. And so the ignorance of the parents reinforces the ignorance of the entire education system, because the education system can only be as open and advanced and as conscious and as developed basically as the parents and also the teachers who are teaching it and who are supporting it and who are paying taxes to fund it. Schools in America, at least, are funded by local taxes. Local real estate taxes fund schools. And if the schools are teaching something the parents don't like, the parents will raise hell. In Kansas, they still have this problem. I don't even know today. Do they teach evolution in Kansas? I don't even know if they do. I think they still teach intelligent design, the sort of stupid Christian version of intelligent design.
Interesting.
I think they're still teaching that.
Wow.
At the very least, they teach it alongside evolution as though these two are sort of equal. Present both sides. Why is that the case? Well, because the parents in Kansas are conservative. So you have to, I'm trying to get you to understand how deeply the ignorance roots itself within human society.
Can definitely see that and understand that and see how it's perpetuated.
We can't have very advanced schools and very advanced teachers teaching very advanced subjects because the majority of the population is too ignorant and too unconscious and too underdeveloped to appreciate the value of those things. And in fact, it will be directly threatened by those things. Just try to imagine what it would be like, for example, in Saudi Arabia, in an elementary school in Saudi Arabia, to teach children at an elementary school level to question the existence of God, Allah. Or the validity of the Quran. If you did this in Saudi Arabia, they would kill you. They would literally kill you for doing that. As a teacher.
Wow.
So
be strange.
It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy effect. When a culture is steeped in ignorance and dogma, then that dogma and ignorance is reinforced in many, many ways. At the most extreme level, it's reinforced by cutting your head off, but there are many subtle ways that it can be enforced. You can be fired, lose your job. You can be demoted. You can be marginalized. You can be outcast. You can be demonized. You can have your reputation tarred and feathered. You can You can be accused of being, a pedophile or something. You can be
How's
like
that related?
the amount of ways you can be demonized and marginalized for your views, if they're radical enough and conflict enough with the prevailing predominant culture, is endless. And we
Yeah.
see this throughout all of human history. This has happened. The brightest, most brilliant human beings, the most conscious and the most developed of every era, have always been demonized, marginalized, had their power taken away from them, and oftentimes imprisoned and killed. Why is that? Because the more conscious and developed you get, the more truthful your perception of reality is. And truth and consciousness and love, these are antithetical to the ego and to survival.
Interesting.
So the most truthful people are the ones that need to be eliminated the soonest with the greatest vengeance, and their reputation need to be tarnished the most. Because that's the only way we can maintain the fictions and constructions that our society and culture is addicted to. Because if we allow all these, brilliant people to rise up and to start teaching, what will happen is that culture, all the constructions and fantasies of culture will start getting deconstructed and questioned and contradicted, and that becomes extremely confusing and threatening to the majority of the population who are not on board with that. And they will revolt, and they will kick those people out of power or kill them. That's how it's always been done since the beginning of human history, and it's still done today, although in developed countries don't really kill people so much for that anymore. But we certainly tarnish their reputations, and we discredit them, and we marginalize them as much as possible, and we absolutely do not give them money and power to be able to have enough influence on the population. Because really, what we're talking about here is a game of fighting for the soul and the mind of the population. It's an influence game. It's a survival game between different meme complexes like science, materialism, atheism, or religion, or whichever religion, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, whatever. All of these different worldviews are fighting with each other for domination and monopolization of the noosphere, the mind sphere of the population. And based on how this mind sphere is manipulated and what kind of constructions are allowed or disallowed, you can then build economies and businesses on top of that. When you have a stupid population, you can build businesses that extract wealth from that stupidity. And so it's this very deep tangle of both the education system, the political system, the business economic system. All of it is entangled together, creating the core of what we call society. And you're in the middle of that. And you're only now, as I'm talking about this, starting to get a little inkling into the fact that you're in the middle of that and how much you were indoctrinated by all this. How unconscious all of this is. All of this is occurring unconsciously. This is not some grand conspiracy to keep you stupid. It's just that people are deeply unconscious, and it takes a lot of effort to raise our consciousness, especially collectively.
We gotta raise our consciousness. It's very difficult to do, individually already, but collectively, especially. How do you raise the consciousness of an entire society? Well, start with yourself, I suppose. Where's the Dank Dollars logo? I'm not sure if we ever had a logo, but we've got a thing right now. We're watching a video, so I'm not sure if the Dank Dollars are of the utmost importance at the moment. But was there ever a logo? I don't think there was ever a logo. We have the dollars. You can spend them as you wish, but no logo. I don't think we ever had logos. But we're focusing on this video at the moment, so we'll try to keep our focus on the video for the duration. Please.
Making sense?
Make sense?
You see? Do you see how long it took me just to explain that? And you still really don't understand what I'm talking about.
So we've been speaking for an hour. He's explained history being difficult to really convey and develop. He's explained how it's difficult to explain things. I guess we can hopefully grasp that, but maybe not so much. He's explained how there's a difference between science and philosophy of science. Hopefully we can understand that, but maybe not fully. And he's just explained here how it's difficult to develop individually and how much time it takes for an individual to develop, and then how difficult it would be for a society or collection to develop, because there are lots of structures that are entrenched in our society that perpetuate being underdeveloped, essentially. Because obviously being underdeveloped perpetuates your survival. If you've survived already and you're underdeveloped, well, just stay underdeveloped. There's no need to understand consciousness in order to survive, and things are just going to survive as they are. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. From the survival perspective, if you're surviving, you don't need to develop anymore. So hopefully we can grasp all those things that he's just laid out for us, and at least only in the superficial level, and maybe we can deepen our understanding at later points.
You're just only seeing the tip of the spear here, and it's taken an hour just to get here.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no way I could have communicated this to you in 5 minutes that you would understand, that would have any impact on you. I mean, I can always condense my teachings down to shorter and shorter little aphorisms and statements. But these aphorisms and statements will only have meaning to the extent that you have an ability to decipher and unpack them.
Yep. So you can say that everybody is already awake or something silly like that, or everything is love, or consciousness is infinity, or all the ridiculous things that we like to hear and say here. It's not going to translate to anybody. It's not going to communicate anything unless it's communicating to somebody who already understands, in which case they don't need to hear it. So why say it? Very difficult. How do we develop a language that bridges this gap of communication from people who don't get something already to try to help them build up and develop their worldview and understanding in the way that he's trying to push? How?
Which you won't have unless you spend hours and hours and hours studying, contemplating it, and taking in all this stuff, all this knowledge, all this information. Here is one of the biggest tricks and mechanisms that the ego mind uses to maintain itself. The ego mind, and generally just in general, even more broadly, your mind is constructing all of reality. But in order for it to feel like it's real and not a construction, you have to be unconscious about the fact that you're constructing reality. You have to deny it. So the mind, as it's constructing, it immediately begins constructing constructions that deny construction is occurring. And you have many of these constructions in your mind. And so when I'm communicating with you, the reason it can take so long and it can be so challenging and it requires so much in-depth explanation is because I'm not dealing with a blank slate. Your mind is already full of 20 or 30 or 50 years of constructions and programming from your culture and your society.
Yes. And it's extremely difficult to try to ignore or to bypass all of the assumptions and things that we've built up, all the baggage that we've built up over the years. Even if we want to, even if we know that this is the task, it's very difficult to do, and it's nearly impossible if you don't understand that that's the task at hand. You need to develop a new way of engaging in the world, not reinforce your old way of engaging in the world. It's going to make it very, very difficult for us to actually try to learn or develop these sort of things that we're trying to develop here.
And you don't even know that that's there. I mean, you know it's there in the abstract sense, but you don't know the full detail of it and the full extent of it. If you did, it would make you vomit immediately. You would be disgusted with yourself. You would have an existential crisis. So you have all these defense mechanisms against acknowledging and admitting and even seeing the construction process occurring. And you don't even know what these defense mechanisms are. I do know what they are because I've studied them for years within myself and within others. And so I'm trying to share some of them with you. The problem that is, though, that you're playing this game of construction. Therefore, the most threatening thing to you is any kind of deconstruction. Therefore, if what I'm teaching is mostly deconstruction, which is what I teach, then your mind is going to be very resistant to that, and you're going to have the full power of your and intelligence of your mind is going to be devoted towards preventing the deconstruction from happening. And so one of the ways that the mind creates a very solid construction such that it feels so real that most people can't even begin to entertain the idea that they're constructing this whole thing right here. It's like, Leo, my mind is not constructing reality. What are you talking about? If I was constructing reality, how come I constructed this shitty life? Precisely because you're constructing it unconsciously. But Leo, if I'm constructing reality, how come I don't look so beautiful? How come I look ugly? Well, you believe you look ugly.
You believe it.
That's
You're
something
beautiful on the inside.
you constructed. You don't see your own beauty.
See the beauty, man. It's all right here.
Because society has created constructions that you adopted unconsciously as to what beauty is.
Following other people's standards and other people's way of viewing the world, not even your own way of viewing the world. It's inherited from the society. Get that nonsense out of here, man. View the world how you want to view the world. See what you want to see. There's value all around you. There's beauty everywhere. There's love all around. Just see it. There's not much more you need to do about it. No justifications necessary, no external reasoning or external justifications. You don't even need justification from your own feelings. Get those feelings out of here. They're nonsense. Just feel it.
And now you're operating on those constructions without even realizing it. So you can't even see your own beauty.
Unfortunate.
So you see, anyways, the way the mind creates this very lifelike construction is simply through sheer quantity. It's not just a couple of constructions. It's a construction wrapped inside of more constructions, wrapped inside of more constructions, inside of more constructions, and it's just this never-ending twisted tangle of thousands of constructions, all buttressing each other, creating a sort of structure that seems to hold. It's really a house of cards, but you can find some pictures and videos of people creating some amazing houses of cards. Look it up on YouTube. You can find some like masterful houses of cards being built.
Interesting.
And they look very stable and they look very impressive. But that's because every card is supporting every other card in this way, such that it creates a sort of a sense of integrity, but it's not really integrity. It's a fiction. It's a fantasy. In the same way that if you want to write a really good novel, sci-fi or fantasy, what do you need to write a really compelling novel that draws you in and is so lifelike and is so immersive that you just get lost in it for weeks? You forget that you even have a normal life. You stop going to work, you stop seeing your children, you stop having sex because this novel is just so engrossing you can't stop until you finish it. How do you do that? as a writer. A lot of detail.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of juicy detail. You're constructing an entire world, the sort of Lord of the Rings world, let's say, where you have all these different creatures and monsters and people and characters, and they're doing things, and it's dramatic and it's interesting and it's all interconnected, and you can draw connections between, like, oh, this person is related to that person, and he came from, he was the son and daughter of this person there, and this, and then you build backstory and future stories, and then you do, backwards projections, future projections, flashbacks and flash forwards, and you combine all this stuff together, and it becomes as though it's its own world.
Another way I like to describe this type of phenomena, what happens is you can overload one way of engaging in the world in such a way that it stops. And then you engage in a different way. So you can say overload what he's doing here. You have so many details that you can't really think about it anymore. So you stop thinking about it and you start doing whatever it is that you do with novels or with narratives. And now you're engaging with the narrative more fully, more really or something. And you really get engaged in it in this way that stops you from engaging in the natural world. So you're fully present, I guess is one way of putting it. You're just there engaging with the narrative. You're no longer intellectualizing about it. One way to think about it. You can overload one system of engaging so that it stops happening. This is something that may happen with people who, we like to talk about word salad a lot on this channel, because we have these spiritual folks and they like to say things that are nonsensical. And sometimes you can just do this. You can induce this sort of weird way of overloading the intellectual mind, or one way of thinking about it may be fatigue, but it's not usually in a negative sense. Well, it doesn't have to be in a negative sense. So you can overload the intellectual mind in such a way that it just stops, it just lets go. And now you're engaging in this sort of more spiritual way. That's one way of putting it. Or you can be engaging in some sort of emotional way, however you like to put it. You're just not engaging in the initial way that you were engaging. So now it feels more real. Now you're more into it. Now you're really resonating with it. Now you're really engaging with it. Whatever language you like to use. You're fully there. One way of thinking about it. So adding all these details could just be overloading. One way of thinking. One way of engaging psychologically with the world to favor another way of engaging psychologically with the world. That's how I'd see it.
And then to deconstruct that becomes very challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Because see, look, let's say I say, oh, well, let's say you're really into Lord of the Rings or something, and I come to you and say, oh, but Frodo is just a character. He's just a fictional character. And you say, no, he's not. What are you talking about, Leo? Frodo is so real. He has parents. I can name you his parents. His mom was so-and-so, and his dad was so-and-so. And I say, yeah, but that's still part of a story. And you say, well, no, that's not part of a story. Lord of the Rings has this like entire continent and world, like Middle Earth. It's an actual place. I don't know what it is. It's a planet or something. I'm not familiar very deeply with the Lord of the Rings
is it on Earth?
Lore.
I think it's on
but
Earth.
you can. I'm sure there's a deep lore there. You can kind of go deeper.
Is Lord of the Rings on Earth? It's called Middle Earth, but is it on Earth? Our planet? Is it like the past or is it the future? Yeah, well, there's lore. There's lore to it.
And deeper into the lore.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there's probably a bunch of fan fiction lore, even on top of what was written in the books. Because people go wild with this stuff and they just start inventing stuff. They probably have invented the name for Frodo's mother and father and where she came from and where he came from and how they met and how they had sex and all this and where they're living and where Middle Earth came from, what it was, evolution was, its entire history. And see, when I start to try to deconstruct for you, Frodo, you're going to drag in the entire fiction of the Lord of the Rings universe. And you're going to keep pointing to every fiction in there to explain why Frodo is real. You're going to say the world is real, and I say, no, the world is not real. You say, but it is because people eat, and people shit, and people die, so it's a real world. But I say, but that's fictional. And you say, no, but it's not fictional. I read about, this character here, he died, and then that character there was born, and then this happened there, and this happened there, and there's a rich history of it. And I say, yeah, but that's all stories. And you say, no, it's not stories. Because you're so bought into it. Because it feels so lifelike. Yeah. You say there's trees and there's rocks and there's mountains and there's cities and they have names and it's so lifelike. There's politics going on and there's a battle between good and evil and this and that. And like, I mean, This is what Game of Thrones did so well. Perhaps an even better example than Lord of the Rings, because Lord of the Rings actually isn't that realistic, whereas Game of Thrones like really took Lord of the Rings and it made it so politically realistic and so kind of brutal and bloody, and like you can imagine living in that world. And people do, and that's the whole appeal of this kind of fantasy stuff. The mind loves imagination. That's because it's constructing everything.
It makes so much sense. I gotta take a short break. BRB. Look at that smile.
Imagination is the only business that the universe is in. There's no other business in town. Reality is imagination. Various gradations of it. You're imagining this whole thing right now. See, that's a very simple explanation. If you ask me what is reality, I'll just say, well, it's all just imagination. And you say, oh, well, yeah, I mean, but that doesn't explain anything. Right, because you're fucking ignorant. You have no foundation for what that means. In the same way that if you ask me, well, what is, you ask a scientist, well, what is matter and energy? They can say, well, E equals mc squared. And you look at that and you say, well, this doesn't tell me anything. It's just a stupid equation. It says nothing. Right, because to understand what E equals mc squared means, you need 12 years of school, and then probably another few years of university. You need to understand every term in that equation. Sure. E, M, C squared. What do these things mean? What does the equal sign mean? And then how does that explain these deeper things about the nature of space-time? People take all this for granted.
Unfortunately,
People
yeah.
expect easy, quick, simple explanations for things, but reality is too complicated for that. So you have to decide, do you really want to understand these questions? If you do, then how serious are you? These are serious life and death questions. That's why they're powerful and important and worth investigating. If all you have to devote is 5 minutes a day, then you're not a serious person. You're not serious about living. And therefore, how great can your life be? It can't be great because you can't understand what life is with that little of a commitment. You take life so for granted that you just want to cruise through it via the path of least resistance in a lazy way. Well, if that's your attitude, then your results, you better expect mediocre results.
What up? So, Leo here is doing his he's doing a lot of emotional attacks. I think we can be considered emotional attacks, right? He's not really doing the effort to communicate his position. I mean, he did for the last hour to communicate his position in a way that other people can understand it. But then he stopped doing it. He dropped that, and now he's just insulting folks who don't understand him to encourage them to try to understand more deeply. I mean, I guess it's an effective way of doing it, but I am not a supporter of just insulting people to understand some things. However, it's probably very effective for some people. I don't know what type of person is motivated by being insulted. I'm not particularly one of these types of people, but surely it is effective for some folks. So we can, accept that and encourage him to do that for the folks that need it. But it comes off as very strange to me personally, where he's just insulting people and saying that they're mindless apes or monkeys, as he's been calling them, and saying that they're lazy for not deeply understanding the world in the way that he is considering it to be deeply understood, so on and so forth. So I'm going to counter signal a little bit, teensy weensy bit here. It's not necessary to understand the world in the way that Leo thinks it's necessary or thinks that is deeper understood. It's not necessary for you to understand the world in the way that Leo thinks that the world is deeply understood. Am I making sense here? I think I'm making a little bit of sense here. And we don't need to insult people who don't understand the world or who don't even attempt to understand the world in the way that Leo is attempting to understand the world. You're fine doing whatever it is that you're doing. Do the things that you like to do, but also understand that it's available to you to develop in the way that Leo is sharing with the world. And there are lots of other ways to develop too. Just appreciate that.
Because life is such a thing that you only get from it what you put into it.
Oh.
Most people are so lazy investing in their lives that they're poor their whole lives.
Oh my gosh.
And I don't mean financially poor, although of course most people are. I mostly mean they're spiritually bankrupt.
Oh no.
Philosophically bankrupt.
Oh my gosh.
Epistemically and metaphysically bankrupt. Psychologically bankrupt.
Whoa. What about aesthetically bankrupt? Leo, come on, tell me about beauty. That's what I like to hear about. Leo, he forgot about aesthetics. Are you aesthetically bankrupt, Leo? Have you been studying aesthetics for the last 12 years of your life? Probably not, but we can appreciate the aesthetics too. I like aesthetics personally. I want to be aesthetically rich. Who cares about epistemics or metaphysics or all that other nonsense? Get that out of here. I don't want spiritual. Get it out of here, man. Give me the beauty. Give me the aesthetics. We don't want to be aesthetically bankrupt around here, please. Let's not be bankrupt in that sense. Let's transfer all of our funds from finances and from spirituality and from science and intelligence. Let's transfer all those funds over to beauty for me, please.
Not be bankrupt in any of these fields. You would need to be serious about them first.
True.
And then to be serious about them, you would need to be serious about life. But you're not very serious about life, are you? You just want some sort of quick, easy answers.
Quick and easy, man.
Well, consider the possibility that the quick, easy answers you want are exactly the ones that are so shallow that they would not significantly improve your life, which is why your life has not significantly improved.
No.
How much your life improves is going to depend precisely, proportionately to the depth of the questions you ask, how deeply you want to live your life, and how much passion and seriousness and effort you're willing to put into it. You can't become great at mathematics if you're uninterested in mathematics.
True.
And you're
So
only
true.
willing to invest 5 minutes a day into mathematics.
100% true.
You're not serious. And so that's the result you get. You're a poor mathematician. Well, all of that works the same way when it comes to consciousness, psychedelics, philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, psychology, sociology, politics, government, relationships, emotions, love, sex.
Art? He's neglecting art.
You only get what you put in. It's a very fair structure, actually. Why should reality give you more than you want for your own self?
I like this perspective.
Why should reality cater to somebody who's so lazy and undisciplined and unserious and shallow as you?
Okay. I like a lot of the perspective. I don't think I like all the perspective. There's we don't need to say that things that are shallow are not valuable, and this obviously this sort of this spectrum of like shallow and depth of shallow and deep. I think that's the right phrase. The perspective or the spectrum of shallow and deep is only from his own biased perspective or his own biased worldview. And it's not necessary for everyone to have that same perspective. So what he considers to be shallow and invalid is just his own interesting perspective. And, you know, it's cool to develop that perspective, but we don't want that invalidation to actually invalidate any other perspectives. Shallow is totally fine. You can develop your shallowness very, very deeply. You can really fully develop your shallowness and whatever it is that you want to develop. You don't need to be interested in epistemology. You don't need to be interested in science. Be interested in whatever the heck it is that you're interested in and develop that as much as you want. And who cares if other people call it shallow? Who cares if other people call it shallow? You don't need to be adopting other people's value systems to destructively override your own value system. Screw them. Develop however you like to develop. So whatever the heck it is that you're interested in, be interested in that thing. Now, of course, you want to be careful and make sure that you're not just interested because other folks around the world have forced you to be interested in that, which is, I guess it's fine too for some people if you care mostly about cohesive societies and you just want to be interested in whatever other people are interested in. But we can encourage to investigate slightly deeper into that and find out whatever the heck you're interested in yourself. And just develop in that thing and don't worry about what other people are telling you to be interested in. You don't need to be caring about your societal norms and the societal things that the society is pushing for you, and you don't need to be caring about the things that these fringe spiritual weirdos are pushing on you. No less, I really like this perspective here. What you put in is what you get out. The things that you are putting effort into is what you're going to be developing, right? You're going to develop the things that you try to develop. You know, you're going to be developing the ways of engaging in the world and the ways that you engage. So if you engage in the world with this sort of shallow things, you're only going to be developing those shallow things. And, you know, If you like the shallow things, that's totally fine. But you could also jump into the deeper things. And I'm using shallow and deep in the language that Leo is presenting here. You can get into the deeper things that Leo thinks are important and that Leo appreciates. And those are fun too. We like those things too. Those are great. So develop those too. And there's probably much, much more out there besides how it's been divided and categorized within Leo's system, or within the typical system that most people categorize these things, or within the typical system that most spiritual people categorize these things. There's much, much, much more. We can appreciate this, hopefully. We can appreciate this, that there's more to reality. There's more to whatever it is, this universe. There's more to whatever it is you want to call it. There's more than what you think is important. There's so much more. So don't neglect everything else that you don't find important. You don't need to be stuck with what you think is important, because there's more. There's more. Please develop. Okay. Lazy.
There's actually a very deep reason for why you only get what you give from reality. And that's because you are reality. You're constructing reality. There's not some other source within reality, like a god sitting up in the clouds, that can shower you with boons and toys and other things that you want. You are reality. If you don't create it for yourself, if you don't furnish yourself with what you want, then you won't get it. If you don't have a deep desire to understand, then you won't understand. Precisely because you are reality.
You gotta have that
For reality
desire
to understand itself, it has to care about itself. If you don't care about reality, you therefore don't also care about yourself. And if you don't care about yourself, then how can you have a good life? How can you expect reality to care for you when you don't care for it? I mean, the logic of this is so clear and it's so simple.
It's so simple. I mean, it's like, I don't know if it's that simple. It's very simple, you know? And you develop this habit of not caring about certain things. You're obviously not going to care about certain things. You've developed this habit. And if you don't care about stuff externally, because you've developed this habit of not caring about stuff externally, it's going to be very difficult to care about stuff internally, because you've developed a habit of not caring about stuff. Can we see that? Can we understand that? Can we appreciate that? If you have this perspective thinking that you've already figured yourself out, or you've already figured reality out, whichever one, it's going to reinforce the opposite. If you think that you figured yourself out, it's going to reinforce that you've already figured out reality. If you think you figured out reality, it's going to reinforce that you've already figured yourself out. If you start to appreciate that there's some things that you don't quite understand yet, there are other fields of development, but there's more to reality than what you think there is already in reality, then you can start to appreciate the depths of yourself within and see all the stuff that you hadn't seen before. And then it expands. And, you know, in some worldviews, they expand in such a way that they encompass each other, and you find out that your reality, who cares about that worldview? Figure it out for yourself. Just appreciate that there's so much more to life, to reality, to whatever, than what you think, and appreciate that. And then you'll start to see there's more to yourself than you think, and you can appreciate that too. And that's going to be nice and beautiful. It's going to be so much fun. Oh, please do it. It's so cool.
The problem is that you've spent the majority of your life as a sheep, as a human sheep, just sleepwalking through life, going through the motions, following the herd, not thinking deeply about anything, taking everything for granted, and not, fundamentally, you're just not serious about life. That's what it really boils down to. You're just not serious about life.
You can be serious about anything. Just be serious about one thing, anything. And that seriousness about that one thing will translate to seriousness about everything. Everything. How you do anything is how you do everything. This is one of those cute little phrases that some people like to say. Just pay attention to one thing, and you'll start to pay attention to everything. And you can appreciate all of the depths of everything. It doesn't matter what you choose. Who cares? You don't need to be choosing the thing that other people think that you need to be choosing. You don't need to value what other people tell you to value. Who cares about spirituality? Who cares about science? Drop it all. You don't need to follow those things. Find whatever it is you want. Go with that. appreciates the depths of that, and you'll start to appreciate the depths of everything. Just build up the habit of taking some things seriously. Do it. It's fun. It's cool. We
That's
love
your
it.
problem. And things for you will not change until you become serious about life.
Oh man, how awful.
When you really become serious about life, you will gladly devote hours and hours into studying and reading and following up on this stuff. You will look at my book list. You will buy every book on my book list. You will read the 200 plus books on my book list. You will devour them. You will take notes on them. You will underline them. You will read.
Is he hypnotizing me right now? You will buy my book list. You will pay for my self-actualization course. You will follow all my videos. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but hey, that's one route. That's one way, a form of a development. You can learn about the book list. I'm sure it's nice. I'm sure it's beautiful. I've never bought. I have not bought the book list. I've not read the books. I'm not a reader personally. I don't read a lot, but I read about trees, and I know that his explanation about trees was a little bit of solo choto, man. It's a little bit not quite. I'm going on a tangent here. Excuse me. Let's
the
finish.
multiple times. You will ask me serious questions rather than just trolling and other bullshit that you do. You will ask serious questions. You will reach out. You will find serious people, serious teachers
Yes, hopefully.
who have serious things to say,
Yes.
and you will appreciate them. And you will go on this journey and you will seriously study and you will do the work. You will contemplate. You will do your homework. And you will do it all on your own without any support whatsoever from your society and from your culture and from your friends and from your family and from your professors and from scientists, from academics, from anybody. You will do it all on your own. That is intrinsic motivation right there. But how many people will do that? 1 in 100,000 maybe? Again, it goes back
That's
to
a
that
lot.
example that we're really poor at developing our own foundation. Really, what's easy in life is getting to a place where you're born, and then you get to a place where the center of gravity of your culture takes you. And then once you're at the center of gravity of your culture, rising above that becomes increasingly harder. And the higher you want to rise above the center of gravity of your culture will require more and more independence of thought from you, more and more discipline, effort, seriousness, purpose, vision, motivation, and the ability to not get distracted by and discouraged by the rest of the herd. Because the higher you try to go from the herd, the more they will call to drag you back in.
Interesting.
And they will use every trick in the book.
It's like a reverse gravity.
They will
Interesting.
demonize the sources and teachers that you're using to advance yourself. They will get you to question why you're doing this at all and that it's not important. They will invite you to have sex with them and to sleep with them and to eat food with them and to go to church with them
ain't got
and
any
to
of
read
that.
the books they read and to watch the movies that they watch.
Okay, most of that. Yeah.
And they will demonize your goal. If you share your goal or vision with them, they'll say, oh, what? That's so crazy. That's ridiculous. Why would anybody want to do that? In fact, that's evil. They will call it satanic. Or they'll say it's dangerous. Well, they're right. It is dangerous. It's dangerous to venture outside the herd.
Yes. Unfortunately. They'll try to reinforce this neglectful mindset where you need to essentially silo off parts of the world and parts of development, ways of engaging in the world, and never develop those things. You need to write those things off, and you need to stick with the things that we like here and that only we encourage over here. For example, reading Leo's books. Don't read other people's books, read Leo's books. For example, don't do those shallow things, only do these deep things. Those things are bad, only do these. Or those things are worthless and not useful, only do these things. These are kind of minor examples, obviously. But more seriously, people do essentially try to encourage cutting off different ways of development. And maybe we can cut off that. Maybe we can encourage people to develop however they want to develop and give them the freedom to develop how they like and deepen their understanding and potentially share with the world other forms of development. There's probably other people out there who are developing in these really unique ways, but they don't know how to communicate it. And nobody else in the world is open to other forms of development, so they don't want to hear how this person has uniquely developed in the world. So we just can't appreciate any of that. But if we had a little bit more openness, and we have the folks over there developing their shallow nonsense, we got the folks over here developing their deep nonsense, and they can communicate with each other, and they can all see and be open with each other and understand that all forms of development are valid forms of development. All forms of engaging in the world are valid forms of engaging in the world. And we can really communicate and develop together as a society, as a world, all singing Kumbaya. It sounds lovely, doesn't it? It sounds nice. And we can make some steps of developing whatever it is that we'd like to develop. Truly feel whatever that feels like. And feel comfortable sharing with other people and not being attacked immediately, not being demonized for it immediately. And feel comfortable allowing other people to share their development and share the way that they've engaged in the world without attacking them and demonizing them and calling them shallow or worthless or whatever. It sounds really nice. One day I hope to be there.
So it's really all up to you. How much do you want out of life?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to get exactly what you put into it. Do you want a lot? Put in a lot. If you take life for granted, you're not going to invest a lot, and you won't get a lot, and you'll be just like the herd. Like everybody else, you'll be mediocre.
No need to insult everybody else.
And if you care about the deep questions, such as what is reality? What is truth? What is consciousness? What is love? What is God? Are we living in a simulation? What is science? Is science true? What role does the mind play in constructing reality? What is the function of philosophy? What is religion about? Where did religion come from? Why does it exist? What are psychedelics? What is awakening? How do I live the good life? How do I be a good person? Why is there evil in the world? What is my purpose in life? What is the meaning of life? What's the point of life? Does life have a point? How do we know anything at all? If you want to ask serious questions like this, then you got to be prepared for serious work, for serious answers. And you have to be aware that the answers could frighten you. And that it's not just a matter of doing a bunch of homework to get the answers. The reason that these questions are rarely answered is not because they can't be answered. It's because the process of answering these questions is so threatening that very few humans go down the roads necessary to get the answers. And when the answers are revealed to them, they don't have the stomach to accept the answers. They reject the answers. They are scared of the answers. They deny the answers. They avoid the answers. They run away from the answers. They demonize the answers. It's not that the answers don't exist. You can answer every single one of these questions absolutely, definitively. But do not expect the answers to be spoon-fed to you by me or anybody else. You have to work for the answers. The answers will only be as good as your intentions to get them, your seriousness, your commitment, your passion, your curiosity. These are the bottlenecks. You are the bottleneck. I am not the bottleneck in your journey of understanding existence. You are. So what are you willing to do about it?
Wow. What an ending. Oh my goodness. Powerful. Leo Gura, everybody. Leo Gura. Not everything can be explained simply. Whoa. That was a very shocking. Usually he ends his videos by saying, okay, that's it. And then he'll have like 30 more minutes at the end of the video after he said it's over. But that was really good. I like that ending. Much more impactful for me, at least. How cool. Curious why I don't read books. No judgment, just like to know my view. I just don't like books. So it's a sort of a carryover from some past, it's kind of the way that I view art and communication and that sort of stuff. So I don't see books often being used. I don't see the unique features of books being utilized for driving the story or driving the message of a particular thing that's being said. So what I mean by that is often a book can be communicated via podcast or video or something like that without losing any information, without missing the essence of the thing that is being communicated. And sometimes things are much better communicated in alternate forms. So for that reason, I kind of have a distaste for the format. Obviously, it doesn't translate 100% because I like to read things like textbooks, which seem to do a very good job of utilizing the format of books to communicate things pretty well, and that's probably better than having a video format or something like that. But most books that people read are not textbooks. So I'm just generally not a fan of the medium. Because of that, I don't read very much. So it carries over to me not reading a lot of spiritual stuff. Kind of a personal preference. In the newest video, he says about an hour and a half in, he's done. And he continues for another hour and a half. Yeah, he does that. So I prefer podcasts and videos. Yeah, it's not really that I prefer, because honestly, the information could be the same in books and videos. It's just that I don't really like when things don't use the format. But it's sort of an aesthetic type of thing. It's an aesthetic kind of preference. If I'm watching a movie, I would like to see things that are unique to movies to drive the story or to drive the message. If they're not using things that are unique to movies, well, why am I watching a movie? I can just read a book or I can look at a podcast or something. I don't need it to be a movie. If the medium isn't driving the message home, why am I using this medium? I don't need this. So if I'm reading a book and it's not actually utilizing some features of the book to drive home the message, why am I reading a book? I can just watch a video of it. It's much easier. It's much more convenient, obviously, to just listen to a podcast. And there's some unique features of listening to a person speak, which can translate some information a little bit easier or better than you can get from text. So those are unique features that are being utilized when communicating via voice or via podcasts. So I like that a little bit better. But that's just more of that's the preference in terms of aesthetics. I just prefer things like that. Not to say that the information in books is any worse, because even if that's the case, you can still have really, really good information in books. But that's just my personal preference. Kind of a carryover from art, though. Okay, well, not everything can be explained simply. It's very good. I really appreciate this video. I don't think he made very hardcore this distinction between the different languages that can be built up. He sort of talked about it quite a bit, by saying you can learn about mathematics, you learn about mathematics for 12 years, and then you can start to understand the math symbols. But he didn't quite explicitly say it. So I like to try to explicitly say it. You can have the natural language, and that's one way of speaking, and that can be very precise in that way, and that's interesting. You can have your mathematical language, and that's a very different way of speaking, and it can be very, very precise to refer to mathematical things. You can have an artistic thing, an artistic way of engaging and developing in the world, and you can develop an art theory or music theory or film theory, so on and so forth, and that can be very, very precise in understanding, and it can be very precise in communicating, that using that language to communicate about art or to communicate about music or whatever it is. You can have emotions, and you can have emotional theory. I'm not sure how we would call this, but you can have emotional language in a way that is very, very precise, and you can explain emotions very well. However, none of these things will translate. So if I have very precise emotional language and I try to explain it using logic, the precision's all gone. If I try to even explain emotional language into natural language, precision's going to be all gone. It's going to be very difficult to keep that precision across different fields. If I speak about music using music theory, I can be very precise. If I try to speak about music using logic or using physics, it's no longer going to be precise. It's going to be very difficult to translate that. So we have to really appreciate that every form of engaging in the world is going to have its own unique language. And if we want something to be simple or precise, we have to use that language. We have to utilize the specific language used to communicate whatever field of study that we're trying to develop or understand. And we can't try to force everybody to translate things back into whichever form of communication we prefer, right? It'd be so, I mean, we already do this now, but it's really bad for people to try to convert morality, for example, back into reason or logic. I want to reason out my morality, and if you can't precisely, simply explain morality with reason, well, then we're going to dismiss morality. That's kind of how things happen already. And that's unfortunate, because you can go into morality and just engage morally, and you'll understand everything very cleanly, very precisely, very simply. You don't need to translate it back to logic. You're going to lose so much. And you start to dismiss things, and you justify and perpetuate this stuckness on one form of engaging in the world. And this is where we get people who are a sort of stereotype of intellectual people who don't care about their emotions, who don't care about social engagements, who don't care to develop their art, or who don't care to develop their spirituality. And we can think in other ways of a person who is overly emotional and they don't care to develop their intellect, and they don't care to develop other things. So we can see how this can happen in different fields and the stuckness. But I like to not encourage that stuckness and encourage a little bit of fluidity, openness of development. Well, that's me, though. To be honest, I'm getting tired of the format of his videos, Leo's videos, huh? So I think his information can be presented in a better way. I certainly think it could be presented in a better way. I don't know exactly what the better way is, and it takes a lot of energy to test A/B testing all the different ways to communicate and what's the most effective way of communicating things. So I think it's good for him to keep developing his format of of speaking and communicating, just kind of the long form, staring at the camera, you know, lots of pauses, no editing. It's probably effective for some people, but it's not going to be effective to the most broad audience. And surely there are going to be other people out there in the world who are developing different ways of communicating spirituality, and it's going to be more effective for a different range of people. And over time, we're going to figure out the most broad way of explaining these things, potentially. But I think it'd be a little bit unfair to try to force Leo to develop his communication skills in such a way that he can just communicate effectively for everybody. It's very difficult to do. So, let him. He has his way of communicating. Too much ego in his delivery. Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. Like, it's very easy to read arrogance in his delivery and lots of other egoic type of things. It's very, very easy to read that. But it could be effective for some people. Some people like that sort of confidence. Some people like to be talked down to. Some people like to be some people are motivated by that sort of arrogance and confidence. So diversity of tactics. If it works for some people, it works. But not my favorite format personally either. So I just find it boring. Yeah, I think it's pretty boring personally too. It takes a lot of effort, I think. Well, not a lot of effort, but it takes a bit of training to really get into that, to not be distracted by our own boredom. It took a long time for me personally to not be distracted by boredom in engaging with certain things. And Leo is one of those certain things where it can be very boring, especially once you get mostly sort of vaguely what he's talking about. Maybe the first couple times you watch it, it's like, oh, this is so new. There's so many interesting topics and things. Oh, and wow, this is so cool. Whoa, it's so interesting. But after 15 hours or however much you've watched Leo, it's kind of boring. Hopefully we can learn how to get past our boredom, but it's kind of boring. 300 hours, yeah, exactly. It's gonna get boring. But hopefully it's still reaching a lot of new people and thrusting them in to see that there's spirituality and consciousness and lots of things that we can develop and understand. And he's opening up this world of possibilities for a lot of people. So I think that's pretty good. Okay, am I done for the day? Let me think about this. Yes, I am done for the day. We've done it. Okay. So I think you need to do a balance between Leo and Connor Murphy. Oh my gosh. Is that possible? I don't think Connor Murphy's that interesting to most people either, so I don't think that's the right answer. I gotta say, I really like Connor Murphy. I think he's extremely entertaining. But I don't think most people find that entertaining. So, yeah. Maybe there's a way of making it more entertaining, but it's hard to do. It's called edutainment, Edutainment. It's hard to do that educational entertainment thing. But man, I think it's so funny. Connor Murphy is really great. I like it. Same for Frank Yang. He's not as crazy as Connor Murphy. He's not at all on the same spectrum. So I don't want to compare the two in that sense. But Frank Yang is also pretty entertaining in his own way. He's got a very unique style of presenting the stuff that I quite like. Can't get into Frank Yang for some reason. Really? Yeah. See, different things for different people. Some people find it interesting. Some people find it boring. I like that there's a diversity in a lot of different people spreading these messages in different ways. And hopefully some people who are going to be influenced by multiple ones are going to be sort of synthesizing the views and potentially get to a broader audience too. So hopefully we'll see that happen. All right, guys, I got to go. It's been a lot of fun. I'll be back on Wednesday. Hopefully y'all are taking good care of yourselves in the meantime. making sure to take care of your sleep, making sure to take care of your diet, making sure to maybe go out for a walk. You know, maybe tell one of your friends that you love them, and I don't know, look at a plant and watch it grow and feel something. Do some things that are psychologically healthy for you, because that stuff's important and it makes everything else downstream of that feel good too. That's my opinion, at least. So, please take good care of yourselves. I'll be back on Wednesday. Come back.
There's nobody here and there's nothing to do.
I'll see you all
Capitita
then.
just subscribed.
Oh, wow. Thanks so much for the subscription. You're helping keep the stream alive. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. All right, y'all. Have a good one. I'll